Hotep, and welcome to Matters of Diversity with Dr. B. Today, we're going to be talking about religion, World Religion Day. And, back in the day when I grew up in a Black church, and what we talked about is, man, we need religion. We need religion today. That was one of the sayings that would be going on. So today we're going to talk about religion, philosophical ways of dealing with religion in our culture. And today I have two great guests, faculty members here at UCF, who are going to kind of bring the word, so to speak. First, we have Dr. Christy Flanagan-Feddon, and she's the Director of Religion and Cultural Studies program here in the Department of Philosophy. She's especially interested in issues associated with culture, ethics, and identity in religion and philosophy. So she, along with my next guest, Dr. Cyrus Zargar, is the co-creator of the Interfaith Dialogue Certificate Program. And Dr. Zargar is Al-Ghazi Distinguished Professor in Islamic Studies here at UCF. His first book, and I'm probably going to say this wrong, and so help me and correct me when you come on, Sufi Aesthetics, Beauty, Love, and the Human Form of Aban. And I'm not doing it correctly, I know, and I'll have him say that title over again in the correct manner. Arabi and Iraqi was published in 2011 by the University of South Carolina Press. His most recent book, The Polished Mirror, Storytelling and the Pursuit of Virtue in Islamic Philosophy and Sufism, was published in 2017 by One World Press. This year, he and his colleague in the philosophy department, again, Dr. Christy Flanagan-Feddon, are a part of moving forward the new Interfaith Dialogue Certificate Program. And so without any further ado, let me bring them both on. How y'all doing? Where are you? There you are.
Hello.
Hi. May I call you Christy and may I call you Cyrus, please?
Yes, please
Absolutely.
do. Yeah, I'd appreciate that.
Excellent. So how are you today?
Doing great. Thank you.
So before we even jump into it, where did I mess up, Cyrus? Where did I mess up? I meant
Honestly,
to ask you before we went on.
it sounded good to me.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So this is a very interesting time, especially when it comes to religion. And so where are you all in terms of your headspace with regards to the things that have been going on in the past couple of weeks?
Right. Where to begin, right? Well, the first thing I guess we could say to that is that it's hard to find a lot of optimism right now, but maybe we could start by saying there's nowhere to go but up, right? In the rebuilding of certain values within this country. And I think at least for me, when I teach in matters of religion and philosophy, I'm actually teaching a class called Faith and Reason this semester. And I kind of, relate my job to almost like a surgeon with a scalpel, that we tend to paint very broad strokes about where religion fits in, American democracy and cultural values and ethics. And we tend to hear very extreme versions of each from either side. And one of the things I try to do is really kind of chip away at that and try to, with a fine tooth comb, try to think about, we don't have to have these extreme discussions, that there are kind of glimmers of hope. That said, the events of the last couple of weeks in particular make that really challenging to even know where to begin, to facilitate, a reasonable dialogue. But that's something that we're trying to do with something like the Interfaith Certificate. But I think we have our work cut out for us, just because it's clear that as a country, we're very stringently divided right now.
Exactly. Yeah.
Go ahead, Cyrus.
Just to pick up a little bit on what Christy was saying, I think the key word in interfaith dialogue, if you want to talk about the past few weeks, is the word dialogue. Pluralism. It's interesting because I'm actually teaching the interfaith dialogue class for the first time ever right now.
Okay.
And the unit we just finished was on what is pluralism? And if you look at the attitude of an attitude that breeds hate, it's an attitude where you have very little interest in knowing about someone else. I remember after the September 11th bombings, there's a famous picture of a man with a sign. And the sign said, "Everything I needed to learn about Islam, I learned on 9/11. So set everything else aside. Look at the attitude. It's a lack of interest in learning about someone else. It's a lack of interest in knowing someone else, engaging with them, lack of empathy, a lack of curiosity. And I think that's really at the heart of what's going on. So interfaith dialogue, in a sense, interreligious dialogue, yes, it's about learning about other religions, but at its core, it's about there's an intercultural component, and even anything that separates people. Could be, if you want to call it race, if you want to call it ethnicity, could be, there's all these things that divide people. How do you not just become interested in learning about about someone else, but learning from them? So I think there is a lot that interfaith dialogue can add to this discussion.
Nice. And I agree with that. So many people are afraid to talk about anything that has to do with religion, especially if you start to make it more faith-based, right? And talk about different denominations and things along those lines. People are hesitant to go there. Why is it important, especially on a college campus, to have these types of courses and to have even this as a major for people? What's the importance behind it?
Well, I think that, the point Cyrus made about empathy is really so crucial because, empathy isn't just an emotion. I mean, it's really a significant characteristic of intellectual curiosity and the ability to learn. Empathy is a significant kind of posture, to moral reasoning. Empathy, is really kind of what makes learning possible, because if we don't have empathy or the ability to kind of substitute our position for the place of another, we're just going to be stuck in a type of stasis. We're never going to learn anything else. Empathy is really kind of the core value for us to move forward and for us to learn. And I think if you look at some of the, there is a dialogue going on right now. I don't know if it's a dialogue in the spirit of the term. There's a discourse. But I think something that, perhaps we could characterize a lot of the discussions going on right now is that stasis. It's a kind of dogmatism on each side. It's a lack of empathy. It's a lack of curiosity or a willingness to understand. And, what we're kind of taught at an early age, that we're not, if you want to, on a first date or a cocktail party, you're not going to talk about religion or politics. And that's kind of what we do all the time.
All the time.
And one of the reasons why, and this is one of the last web chats that we did for Interfaith Dialogue, was to talk about like interfaith and social justice. And one of the topics we talked about is I question how we've sort of approached the notion of justice in the United States, that we have a history of seeing justice as this kind of blind, neutral, like anonymous concept. And I think there's a value to that, this idea that if we can just kind of have this general justice, it's going to apply to everybody. The problem, though, is that now in 2021, we see that maybe that wasn't the best way to go about it, because now we have a certain mold of class, of race, of sex, whatever the case, of religious identity, that justice, in which that justice is supposed to fit. And so, that idea of trying to, carve this kind of, not the scalpel approach, but the kind of, the more refined approach is to see that there are ways in which religious identity can help us understand. Religious identity doesn't always have to be associated with, the conversation stoppers or the extremism. There are ways in which we can understand how religious identity can inform, democratic values or social identity or, collective responsibility. And that's one of the things that's really at the heart of interfaith dialogue, is that's at the core of many different religious traditions, is trying to cultivate some of these values and this awareness and this empathy. And it's just that because we have many different backgrounds and traditions, languages, ethnic identities, there's just a different way to access it. But it doesn't mean that we can't still come together collectively as part of, our democratic commitments as well.
So, when I think about it in terms of philosophy, right? The philosophy of thought, and you really dig in and you kind of deal with the situation that's at hand, right? I took a philosophy of religion course in my undergraduate years, and it was one of the most phenomenal classes that I took because I grew up in the Baptist background.
Mm-hmm.
And so to see the different narratives was really a great thing, right? To be open to have your mind open to those types of things. The principles that come with religion seem to all be similar in terms of the effect of it all. How come that simple truth of what everybody believes in, and maybe I'm off the beaten path here, but how does it become so extreme based on how people view it? Is that a philosophical question,
right,
or is that something that can be answered, or is it just what it is?
Well, I think you're right that, if we could identify, a couple characteristics that unite almost all of the major world's religions, it's some kind of sense of, an infinite concern or a concern about, matters ultimate, whether we want to explain it in case of origins or, how existence came to be, how we were created, or whether you want to talk about it in terms of ultimacy, where are we headed, in terms of our bodies, in terms of existence as such. And with that comes a certain level of, moral responsibility. It gets back to that empathy and humility concept that we're talking about before. I know that, as it's always kind of been a pedagogical commitment of mine to, when I'm teaching, to say very little about my own beliefs and my own commitments. That's just, not everyone agrees with me on that. And I can understand why, but I've just always felt that I'm teaching, a tradition or a philosopher, and I'm just going to kind of present this and in the best view possible, and you kind of take it or leave it.
Yeah.
Now, it's getting harder and harder to maintain a kind of pure political social agnosticism as time goes on, especially right now. And now I'm challenged by that because I almost feel that I have a moral commitment to not have such a neutral view.
Okay.
And that's still something that I wrestle with because I really want the classroom to be a safe space where I want to hear what people have to say. And it's not that anyone's going to get a free pass, but but we're here to talk about it. We're here to dialogue.
Let me ask you a question then.
Yeah.
With that. Where is the place for role modeling in teaching?
In terms of
you
who we are personally?
Right.
Because we're all scoundrels at the end of the day.
Keep it to yourself, right? Your views are not a part of the equation. But is there a way to share your views without it being so intrusive to the conversation that welcomes the conversation of others who may have opposing or different viewpoints?
I agree. And that's, particularly kind of, you asked the question of like, if all world religions, have these general values, where do things go astray? I don't have the answer to that. I think one area, and this is kind of where I was starting to veer into this path, where I'm still not going to show all my cards, but I might show a card or two, where I'm deeply uncomfortable, as a philosopher and a scholar of religion, when we start making claims that don't have some type of interest in the public consensus. And this is just part of, general kind of democratic values. I'm very interested in philosophy as it changed after the Enlightenment. So there's a strong emphasis on human reason and our ability to kind of use our natural goods, to make determinations about what is right. And just kind of something that I look at intellectually. I'm interested in those shifts. Like, how can we still talk about religion and philosophy after the Enlightenment, after this emphasis on reason and science and technology? And somewhere along the way, certain claims became a lot less intellectually curious, I would say, and more dogmatic. And it's the dogmatic claims that become more difficult to talk about. And those are also the type of religious claims that people get really uneasy about, to talk about in the public sphere. And that's what we have to think about, that it doesn't have to be that way.
Okay.
Well, I could kind of chime in a little.
Yeah.
There's some really great comments here, but about this idea of, what causes, if you want to say, like kinds of different extremisms and people to kind of hunker down into some sort of belief. Well, the one thing that you see in the different religions of the world and even beyond religion is this term myth. And in religious studies, myth seems something very different than it does in the common usage of, outside of like religion and folklore and anthropology and all that. We use myth in these fields a certain way. It doesn't matter if it's true or false. So like take the story of the founding fathers, as they're called, of the United States of America. That could be elevated to the status of myth, despite the fact that it's historically true, when it begins to have a kind of sacred quality to it. So people start to organize themselves around these myths. Now, all the religions of the world, they have these myths, right? Everybody's organizing themselves around myth, and they keep doing it. There's new myths. They come up every year. Right. Somewhere along the line, for example, in American history, a myth appeared about race. And it's fascinating that myth, it doesn't go away. Even the terms of it, the Caucasus Mountains, where these beautiful, people, the Caucasian people came from. It's a story. It's not true, but it was tied to another myth about theories of evolution that are now debunked, that ended up forming a myth that has stayed and that you're seeing has become kind of dangerous. And why is that myth so powerful?
Yeah. Are you kind of saying those are parables that have kind of...
What I'm saying is, if I belong to a group, okay, let's say I belong to a group and I think of myself as superior in some ways because I belong to that group. The backbone of that group is based on a story that makes us superior. And that story could be where we're from. We come from some superior, we come from, these are our ancestors, right? They want to create a story. This is why people are interested in ancestry.com and stuff. They want to know the story of their background, the story of their life, okay? Now, what happens is sometimes pernicious and dangerous myths people start to organize themselves around them for reasons. There's a reason for it. There's a reason they latch on to it. Fear, poverty. Sometimes it's changes in the demographics of your society or the way you're taught, or as you said, role models. Role models are very powerful. And then what happens is the way to counter it is to bring another powerful myth. And you see this happening right now in the United States. A politician will come and say, listen, this is a country of immigrants. That's a myth too. I'm not saying it's not true. I don't know if it's true. It doesn't matter to me if it's true. Right. But it's another powerful story if I start to tell you this is a country of immigrants, because I'm trying to reframe the story so that you start to see it a different way. So everybody's storytelling. Everybody's storytelling and drawing people into these different stories, and everybody's trying to have the most powerful story or to associate themselves with some story, with some myth.
Control.
Yeah.
They want to control the narrative. That's what their story is doing.
And they want to make their own narrative.
Well, you know what? You just made a beautiful connection to how we see the world, right? Because most people see America based on that narrative, that story, right? That myth that you just talked about, that we're a nation of immigrants. Now, that may be something that we have become, but that is not what we were. Wow, that was powerful.
Yeah, well, yeah. I think that people who understand that, and sometimes they might not seem to be they might seem very simple, but people who understand the power of a good story, can through just through little provocations, use that storytelling ability to start to mobilize people. And you could do it in a good way. You could do it for purposes that are ethical. You could do it for purposes that are unethical. And I think that at the end of the day is what we're seeing happening, you know?
So go with that. How do you take something that's good and make it unethical?
Well, here's the thing. Now I'm going to put my cards on the table, because I do believe in human nature. And I know that that's for a lot of people, philosophers and other people, that's something that's a controversial kind of thing. I believe in human nature, and I believe, and I don't know, I wouldn't go so far as to say whether human nature is good or evil.
Okay.
I think there's a goodness there, but I think it's possible that we have, this is going to sound kind of crazy, but since you opened up the door, I think it's possible we have competing human natures, that we have two sides to ourselves. One side of ourself is a side that fights for survival. And another side of ourselves might possibly not even come from this domain, from this world that we live in.
So, which is why you would believe the narrative that's false if you're trying to fight for your survival.
I think there's certain narratives that appeal to a narrative has to appeal to human nature, but it can bring out different things in that nature. This is me talking. This is not something I would ever teach in the classroom or even write in an academic paper. This is me talking as a human being. I do believe that there are different.
So let me stop you there.
Yeah, go ahead.
Ask you, how come not in the classroom, and how come not in a paper that you write?
Not in a paper that I write because I have to prove it, and not in the classroom because I don't see the classroom as my own. It's not my space.
Okay, I get that part of it, but
yeah,
isn't philosophy about proving the point of things that may not be obtainable?
True. And I think I'm trying, I would hope that in the course of my career, I could eventually have something interesting to say about human nature and somehow get there.
Interesting. You said a lot. And
well,
that
thank you.
sign behind you says even more. I love it.
Yeah.
I do.
Thank you.
You got to do it repeatedly, right?
Yeah. I'll let Christy, if you.
No, I just say, Cyrus, you reminded me, you know, there are a lot of theories of religious identity, you know, religion as the kind of, you know, epistemic placeholder that you really reminded me of, that, you know, and I think that this could explain a little bit as to why maybe some of the mythology went bad, if you will. There are a ton of folks in the history of, you know, religious thought, like Freud is one of them, you know, who argued that, you know, religious identity is kind of this ultimate placeholder, that it's this kind of attachment that we have in order to explain the unexplainable. And, you know, there's a point where we have to sort of let it go. And I think that one of the ways in which religious identity can become more problematic is how we kind of utilize this placeholder, because ultimately, you know, the world's biggest questions, the world's biggest philosophical questions, you know, often are religious questions, you know, these questions of ultimacy, these questions of, you know, how I am to treat other people based on my own identity. You know, where are we going? What is the meaning of the world? And these are good questions that, again, getting back to kind of the natural empathy and curiosity we ought to have. But when we start to get worried about what answers those questions could yield, when you start to get concerned about the fact that we don't know, that's when we might cling a little bit more to some of these other mythologies, you know, that Cyrus was talking about. And that's when perhaps we become a little less curious, because now we have a little bit more invested, where, well, the way I explain what's going on and the way I cope with the uncertainty of the world or the unrest is to cling even more to a certain narrative that I've been told. And the divisiveness of that narrative might actually give me a type of comfort, you know, because now I'm part of a group that knows, I'm part of a group that understands, and that we're going to get through all of the chaos, all of the tumult. I just need to cling to my narrative even further, because this is how we're going to get through it. And this is where people, I think, get really uncomfortable, you know, about religion in kind of the public sphere. Because if you have if you have a narrative, if you have a story that puts your group at odds with somebody else, or the example that Cyrus gave that says that your group is better, that says that your group has some kind of claim over whatever, over land, over racial identity, or really kind of the story of America. I mean, that's sort of where we're at right now, is we're sort of rethinking, what is our story going to be? What are we going to say from here on out? We have a collection of stories. And now we sort of have to determine which of these stories are going to define us, going forward. But something that really interests me, kind of, again, I'm always really interested in where religion and philosophy intersect.
Right.
There's a trend, for example, in comparative religious ethics that it's been going probably really since 9/11 was really what kind of brought it on in particular. But it's called the pragmatic turn. And so it's a group of scholars that we're really trying to think about how is it that we can look at religious reasons or religious groundings for ethical claims that still are true to kind of the spirit of pragmatism. And pragmatism, is a big part of kind of American democracy and American cultural identity. This idea that, the notion of truth is something that's born out of a notion of collectivity and consensus and rationality. We don't have special access to the truth or supernatural claim to the truth. We're going to sit here and talk about the truth, and you're going to challenge me, and we're going to decide collectively, what we regard as being true. And so that's something that I studied a lot in graduate school, and my advisor was very interested in, again, kind of looking at a lot of comparative religious ethics after 9/11. And that's something that I'm really interested in, because it's a story that we don't talk a lot about when we're trying to figure out where does religious identity fit in American culture. Because we're worried about the extreme discussions where we're basically, kind of the competing narratives, where someone's going to say, I'm going to justify this action, or this is the way it is because my God says so. And the problem is that if my understanding of God is different than yours, Richard Rorty was famous for saying, well, religion is a conversation stopper. We've got nothing left to talk about.
So let me ask you a question about that, right? Because I get that, that people run to that, they cling to that particular piece, right? They run that's not how my God sees it, or whatever have you. How, though, do we see the same thing and come away with such different interpretation of what it is?
Well, that's where, we have like the political components, the societal components. That's where, because the question is, what exactly is it that we're looking at? Are we looking at some kind of sort of natural fact that a lot of different religions are trying to access?
Right.
Or are we looking at some idea that only my religion knows? And that's, that's what's made me somehow preferred, or that's what gives me this different story.
So I asked you that question in regards to the connection of social justice to religion, right? You spoke about that.
Right.
And if we were to tie that into what happened on last Wednesday, right? We've all seen it, the same thing. But there is so much difference of opinion as to what occurred or how it happened. And it's based sometimes around religion. And that's what my thought was.
Right. And I guess I would say a statement that's more philosophically viable as well as kind of morally sound would be say that I'm making some kind of observation or based on what happened, because where I can say my religious identity gets me there, but yet I'm not going to say anything that's a violation of democracy. For example, when we had this last web talk, and this is prescient, as Monday is, Martin Luther King Jr. Day, that, when we look at arguments for civil rights in the 1960s, you look at letters from Dr. King, he was speaking as a civil rights leader, but he was also speaking as a Christian. And so he made claims, talking about the injustice of the laws. He didn't only talk about how they were wrong from a racial point of view, but he appealed to Augustine. he appealed to Aquinas and talked about, an unjust law is not a law at all, based on certain principles. But so there's a certain religious basis for what he's saying, but it was also based in a type of Christian personalism that is really just about the general identity of the human person that a lot of people could understand. You don't have to be a Christian to have special access to his justification for that particular argument. You understand why it was important to him, and he made appeals to others, like Christian pastors who he wanted to get involved, who he didn't think were involved enough in the movement. But it was still, in terms of this kind of giving and taking of reasons and this pragmatic spirit of religious identity, he wasn't saying anything that only a Christian would have special access to understand. He was still making a claim that was on the basis of general democratic values, values that are from the Declaration of Independence.
Right.
So those are certain type of religious arguments that we don't really talk about, because instead we look at these broad arguments to say that, God has ordained a president, or we have to protect ourselves from, there's a certain apocalypticism, which is another conversation that I'd love to talk to. I don't know if we have time. I'll get even more, religiously nerdy, but there's a certain type of, when you start to say that I have a type of special access to the truth based on my religious belief, that's problematic from, a point of view of religious ethics, but it's also problematic from a philosophical point of view, because I don't have any information to verify that claim. I don't have, it doesn't really follow the basic methods of truth and verification if I have some kind of special access to the truth. And democratically, we have to be interested in claims and arguments that whether or not you understand my personal kind of set of values, I'm still going to make some kind of claim that can be justified as a result of general democratic human goods, social goods that we can all still understand. And that's the difference. And that's where we still have a space to have a little bit more dialogue about different religious belief if we still understand that the only, we're trying to justify ideas that can be universally understood within democracy, and you don't have to be part of a particular faith tradition to understand that.
Nice.
I could just make a brief comment. So one of the things that we learn in interfaith studies or interfaith dialogue in the class that I'm teaching, and this comes from studies in sociology, is that the greatest way to dispel hatred and distrust of one community for another, or one person for a community or whatever, isn't learning. And so I'm sorry, I wish it were, because that's my job. I wish that I could say that, for example, if you learn about Islam and you hate Muslims, or you learn about Judaism and you don't like Jewish people, you're anti-Semitic, that the answer is to study their religion. But it's not. Actually, the best way is to start to meet people from that group.
Thank you.
It's proven. And so when you meet people from that group, because you have a certain, so for example, you say, all Muslims are whatever.
Yeah.
All Jewish people are whatever. You have this idea in your mind. You meet one, you see it as an exception. You say, well, all of them are everybody except Abdullah. then you go to the mosque, or you go to the synagogue, or you go to this gathering. You start to meet people. You start to, your whole world view can shift.
Yes.
By that kind of exposure.
Yeah. But you need a lot of study abroads, is what you're saying.
And you can study abroad, but also visiting religious sites, connecting with other people, but not just connecting, like talking about PlayStation, but talking about who they are, right? So it's not, because it's not that, let's say Abdullah and I, if I'm not Muslim, we get along because of PlayStation, and so he's some exception to being Muslim. If I know him as a Muslim, or I know him as someone who's Jewish, you see. So I will say this. I'm going to go out on a limb here, and it might be an unpopular statement, but I'm going to say
a limb for you so you don't fall off.
So many of the people who stormed the Capitol, I think there are people who live in large urban areas that are diverse. And they totally don't, they make me like, who are these people? I haven't seen this, or I don't get it, or whatever. Maybe not, I don't know. But I know them. I know those people. I grew up in the greater Cincinnati area. In Northern Kentucky, I've had dinner at some of their houses. I know those people. I've seen the hatred. I've seen the love.
Right.
I know that they're not inherently evil people. Some of them, at least, many of them. I'm saying I know that there's some problem in their under comprehension, who they connected with, something they were lied to. I'm saying I try to come out with a very sympathetic. I try to see them as human beings. But the reason I can do that, the reason I can say, I'm not going to say you're all evil because you did something or because you said something.
Right. It'd be the same thing as pointing the finger at yourself.
Right. And it's because I've known them. It's because I've known people like that. I've known people from that group. I've met them. I've seen some people like that change. I've taught at a school that was, it was Augustana College. It was like 3 hours from Chicago.
Right.
And we would have students come to that school who came from certain towns in Illinois that were populated by like 400 people.
Yes.
And all of them were of the same religion, same race, same background. And they would come and it was just an eye-opening experience to take their first class on, let's say, Islamic studies or, on Jewish studies. It was just, and meeting other people from different groups. And you would see in that first year and that second year, a huge growth and huge changes. Now, for some people that doesn't happen. And it really should happen, I would say, at a key moment in your life, hopefully when you're 18, 19, when you're still open-minded.
That would be nice.
It'd be nice.
I taught in Missouri for 7 years, and in a lot of in the area I was in St. Louis, but it's very segregated. And there were people, I teach master's level counseling. And the first time in my life did I ever have students who didn't identify as Black or Latino or whatever have you say to me, "You're the first Black instructor I have ever had in all of my schooling." And that means going from pre-K to 12th grade to all of their undergraduate years, if they did other things in undergraduate. When they got to their master's program, was the first time someone standing in front of them teaching looked like me. And that goes to what you were saying just there. It's like part of the conversation and the dialogue that you need to have is with people who you have heard so much about, right? And there's something to be said about unlearning what you've learned and starting all over again and meeting people where they are, right? And so I'm sorry I cut you off, but you just made
No, I'm glad you did, because that's a great point. In fact, I think you brought up one of the things that didn't even come to my mind, which was travel, which we can't do right now because of this whole pandemic. But that's another thing. There are ways to travel. There are certain people that when they travel, they create little bubbles of of home, and they take them with them wherever they go, and they judge the different cultures that they're exposed to, and they laugh at this and they smirk at that. That kind of travel won't help you. But if you travel with an open mind and an open heart, and you really immerse yourself and try to just take it all in, I know for me, it's transformational.
Go to be transformed, not to go get artifacts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right. Oh, I brought home, look at this beautiful thing that they made over there, and not have any concept of what their life is like over there. Mm-hmm. But you got a real nice item to decorate your home with, Yeah. Very interesting. I see you nodding. What's going on, Christy?
Oh my gosh, I don't know what I could contribute. I don't know what I could contribute to that last discussion right there. I can identify in some level just because I grew up in Illinois. I grew up in the Chicago area, but I know very well where Augustana is. And I know that I think the experience I had from when I was 18 to 19 was really transformative, because I grew up in a far western suburb of Chicago, very, very heterogeneous, very white, I went to a high school of about 3,000 people. And I would say there was maybe one, I don't know, I would say it was 99.9% white. And then I went to college at DePaul University in Chicago, which it was a very deliberate decision, and it really kind of changed my life. And it was an amazing experience to move to the city. And, DePaul is something that it's been recognized for its diversity programs since its inception. And it's part of a kind of Vincentian Catholic intellectual tradition that emphasizes service. And it was, it changed, it opened my eyes to a lot of different things. And it was really that kind of experience that I can't tell you how many times I remember kind of class ends and having a coffee, and it was the first time I had, met with someone whose parents were born in another country or spoke a language that wasn't English at home. And, that it truly changed who I am, and it opened my eyes to a lot. And so I, like Cyrus was saying, I very much understand and know people, who have, these perspectives, these arguments. And a lot of what's going on right now really is a kind of fear or a desire for protectionism over in America that they think we're losing. And it gets back to this idea of the mythology and the story that's being told. And I think that that's where I don't entirely know how to bridge that divide. I do know that one of the hope for religious dialogue is that at its heart, religious identity argues that there's a world beyond oneself.
Yes.
And there's a world to whom we're held accountable, to which we should be humbled. And I hope that, for me, I do think that is the possibility of transformation. That where it hurts and where it's hard is that you also see religious identity being kind of wielded as a weapon. And we see that a lot too. And that kind of gets back to that stasis idea I was talking about before. I don't have a great answer to that other than to keep harping down this idea that it doesn't have to be this way. We have a lot of examples of.
And that's the thing, though. I think you stated it really beautifully. And I think what happens is that people, so in counseling, we have to meet people where they are, right? And we have to have hope that they'll have an open mind and really want to delve into the difficult dialogue or the difficult situation to kind of break beyond it. But the fear is that if I touch it, if I talk about it, if I do something about it, since I don't know, the unknown is what's the problem, right? Because I don't know what will be on the other side of me dealing with this abusive relationship, what's going to be on the other side of me doing this or doing that. I'm going to stay here because I'm going to stay comfortable in my discontent so that I don't end up being worse off than I am, right? And so I think that's what I hear in some of what you're talking about, that people don't want to give up the possibility of losing what they think is the best thing for them, because that was the narrative or the story that was told to them that they needed to build upon, right? So they stay maybe Republican or Democratic or independent or whatever they are because of those stories, and not because they understand what's happening in the realm of it, but because they were told this is where you need to stay.
Right.
Yeah.
And when it comes to kind of politics 101, really fear is what sells, and over the last, say, 25 years or so, when within a certain demographic, religious identity really became part of the religious right, then you not only do you have the general kind of narrative of political fear and social fear, now you have this, eschatological fear that's very powerful, where now not only do we have to preserve a certain cultural identity, but we have to preserve a world in preparation for something else. And that's a powerful mix. That's a powerful mix going on right there. And because all of my kind of fancy academic discussions of truth and justification and pragmatic discussions doesn't hold a lot of weight.
When it boils down to everything that you've done in life is going to end you here when you die.
It's hard to compete with that.
And I mean, the idea is that, in a sense, at the university, we very often think in terms of majors, like, you do this major, you get this job, that's your identity, that's who you are. But dealing in religious studies as we do, we know that a lot of the people we interact with, they're not going to major in religion or philosophy. They might come for a class or two. So that's where Christy and I had this idea of, okay, well, if it's a certificate,
yes,
this could be this could be a nurse who's treating someone. This could be a a business person who's dealing with different people, or a police officer, and if they have this some of the things that we've been talking about here today, if they have like a basic understanding of religion, interfaith dialogue, these concepts, if they have a basic understanding, they take that to their workplace, take that to their little communities.
Yeah.
That could have a big effect, you know?
Yeah. So there's a myth that you brought up, and this is kind of interesting. So I'm going to play with that myth theme, right?
Okay.
So you have a politician,
All right,
who believes along the lines of a Christian, who then goes and does his job. But in the job, when they're creating laws and bills and all these other things, it is tinged with, or it is fully embraced by religious thought process, belief systems, or whatever have you, right? So when they go to vote for this particular law, they're voting their principles. They're voting their religious beliefs and things along those lines, and they become law. But in society, we're told we can't bring that to work. We're supposed to leave our religion at the door when we go into our work environment. And seems to be the only work environment that someone can go into and get away with it. Is that, am I off the beaten path with that?
No, it's a really interesting point. I mean, that you're making. It's almost like you're saying, like it's like religion has kind of found a way into politics that we are okay with when we're not okay with it in other professional domains. It's kind of fascinating now that you bring it up. That's a very good point. Yeah. It's almost as if politics needs religion. I mean, what would it be like to swear in a president without a Bible? What would it be like to start an important, Senate judiciary meeting or whatever they do without some invocation? Or it's almost like you need that authority.
If someone brought is it the Torah or some other
the Quran, or
and they brought that to swear themselves into, and it has happened. And there's been controversy.
Yeah, Keith Ellison. I mean, Keith Ellison did something. It was a very smart thing. He had them use Thomas Jefferson's Quran because he's Muslim. So they use Thomas Jefferson's Quran, and that way, no one can say that it's un-American. But I think you're completely right, and people will take evangelicals to task for some of the changes that have happened politically recently, and saying that, well, it doesn't hold up. Yeah. But see, this is the thing about myth and what makes it so powerful. It's very adaptable. And the biblical tradition, Christy can correct me if I'm wrong, but it's so copious. It's so wide. There's so much there to draw from. So for example, what do you do if you have certain moral beliefs, but the leader, you just know that he's not, in his personal life, he might not be the most Christian person? Right. Well, you dig into the Bible and there's this great story of who? Cyrus the Great, and he's this he's not Jewish. He's a king. He doesn't belong to that's religion of God, but he serves God's purpose, Yeah. I'm sorry. That's pretty decent myth making right there. That it works on both sides that way.
You crack me up when you say that, because what the thought that came to my mind just now was the Bible and anything else is man written.
Well, I mean, but not if you. I mean, it depends. It depends on the person's perspective, right? I mean, for you
and I, perspective is someone sat down and wrote a story about what was happening in their area or in that day and age. Whether it comes from God or not, no matter what, it was written. And it seemed to play out because other people were writing the same thing or close to the way that they saw it happen. And it became, in a sense, law.
But I think if you're talking to someone, it depends if their point of view is that this is the divine word, even if historically
speaking, it wasn't a defined word.
No, I know.
Man wrote that it was a defined word
in an inspired way. I'm saying let's assume historically you're right. Yeah, I'm not going to disagree with that. But if you're talking to someone who doesn't hold that position, it's kind of like you have two choices. You can try to get them to see it your way about the Bible, or you can go with them along their way of seeing the Bible and say, okay, but there are, even if you believe every word of the Bible is God's word, there are certain contradictions in the position you're holding. You know, the Bible also says this, the Bible also says that, Jesus said this, Jesus taught that. And so it's like both ways have value. Trying to go for, trying to prove a point and be kind of correct and true in some way, or meeting someone halfway in their truth. But at the end of the day, I think meeting someone in their own truth and talking to them in their own tradition, it has a kind of effectiveness to it, and that's interfaith dialogue, really. Yeah.
And it's still also, with kind of getting to this, the idea of kind of dialogue and justification, is that, one of the ways that, this move within religious studies and trying to understand how, religious commitments don't necessarily have to contradict other moral commitments is that you're trying to make these connections. And one way to try to do that is to look at the consistency of the different values that you hold. And so Cyrus's example is a really good one, that, if someone, believes in, a literalist interpretation of the New Testament, or the, as a Christian, of the Bible, you could ask, well, there are inconsistencies there, and in terms of, so do you maintain certain, purification laws that are also in the Old Testament, for example, and in the Hebrew Bible. And so there's a way to sort of understand that, there are some inconsistencies in those commitments, and you don't have to do it without kind of blowing the whole worldview out of the, challenging the entire thing, but you can do it kind of piece by piece. And it's a different way of talking about religious commitment, because, we can't really change someone's religious identity. We can change how we understand what the religious identity compels them to do. And we can also change how we can come together, because we can share the same commitments, even being part of different religious traditions. And that's the one thing that I think we're really kind of suffering from, is that, because of this idea that, the sort of approach that we've taken in America is this kind of pure secularism, that because it's just so difficult and it's so complicated, we've just taken this pure separation, not only in terms of church and state from a legal perspective and a policymaking perspective, but also in a social perspective. And, and I think it's really set America apart in our cultural awareness, behind. And I don't, not apart in a good way. I think it's really, it's put us back. And,
our nature right now to go
absolutely. Well, sure. I think we're just fundamentally unable to handle the complexity of religious identity. We just tend to draw it's an either or, and we're not interested in the nuances of people's identities.
Yeah. So can it be true then, though, that God's word is sacred, divine, but the interpretation that was written by man was inconsistent and wrong sometimes? Is it wrong to say that, or to have that type of a thought process?
See that? I can Chrissy respond, but my immediate reaction would be that it's kind of up to you. Because like the tools of religious studies don't give us anything to answer that question.
Okay.
Because if we begin to try to answer that question, which I think it makes sense. What you're saying makes a lot of sense, but I think we put ourselves out there in that way and kind of adjudicate between different religious beliefs. It's almost like overstepping what the tools that we have, what we use to measure. Tools we have aren't used to measure those kinds of truths.
Okay.
But at least the tools I have.
We went from being very primitive in our nature to being the most technological in our nature. But religion has stayed the same.
It has, but looking at like the three the Western religions, so Judaism, Christianity, Islam. If you look at how they've stayed the same, the basic principles have to do with kind of like ethical things that technology wouldn't change. Technology lets us do things faster. It lets us do things better. But at the end of the day, what we want to do hasn't changed. We still basically want to conquer, have sex, eat. It's like all the same stuff.
It's all the same stuff.
All the same stuff. And so I can get how these religions that are thousands of years old still work today. It's because, going back to that whole human nature thing, if there is a human nature, or there's some
that work.
Yeah, it's the principles, it's the ethical principles that they hold up really well. They give you something. I mean, like,
well, that goes back to your human nature thing, right?
Yeah.
Human nature, and I'm not trying to say this is not how it was, but human nature wrote the Bible, or wrote the Quran, or the Torah. It was human nature. And so, yes, was it the word of God? I believe so. Yes, I do. But because it was written by man, that's why it's left for interpretation. So man, what you're saying is this truth, is that we are by those five, Maslow's hierarchy of need. We need shelter, we need love, and all those other things. Of course, that's going to stay the same throughout time, because we need shelter, we need love, we need, in order to continue moving forward. But that doesn't say that,
Well,
what if they got one word wrong? What if they got one word wrong?
Well, I mean, I think, again, Christy's the one who should tell me if I'm right or wrong. I mean, I think the idea of literalism in Christianity is pretty recent, right?
Is it?
The idea that there's every word, it's a newer 200 years, it's like even in the Bible, even the Bible's own audience, they don't seem to have been literalists as far as I know.
Right. I mean, for what it's worth, probably the single most experience that motivated me actually to go to graduate school for religious studies was to learn about really the complexity of early Christianity and the diversity of the tradition. So I took this class as an elective on the New Testament, and I learned that there were non-canonical gospels, gospels that were not part of the actual canonized New Testament as it was assimilated a couple hundred years later. And it blew my mind. I thought that this was the most fascinating thing. There's something called the Gospel of Thomas that talked about, it was a very different story of Jesus without the passion, so without the crucifixion on the cross, and this idea of salvation as this kind of path towards self-knowledge, and the kingdom of God is already here. And it was fascinating. And, there's evidence that this text was in Coptic Egyptian monasteries, contemporary to the canonized gospels. And it was fascinating. And so early Christianity was an extremely diverse time. There was not a consensus about Jesus's message. And it took a couple hundred years for us to have the canon of what is now known as the New Testament. And even that, there isn't a strong there's a consensus, but different denominations of Christianity do look at different texts within the Bible. So all that is to say is, I think that there's a way to appreciate the revealed truth of this text, while also accounting for the possibility of human error, for whether it's by what was written down, as you were saying, or whether it's just, the stories that were left out. I mean, this is true for history, generally speaking. And this is kind of the approach I've always taken, is that history isn't infallible, right? It's the stories of whose stories we have available to us. And so I think
that I think it's a proverb that says, the lion's story would be a little bit different if it was told by the lion instead of the person who caught him and killed him. I'm gonna let Cyrus go real quick, but we're coming close to the very end of our hour.
Okay, I'll just try to. I'll make it a minute. I'll just keep it real quick, because I want to flip everything. So I totally get what you're saying. And that's the premise that we all work under in our daily lives, living in this secular modern world. It's that, we should take scriptures and religions to be historically kind of like something that developed and things like that. And that's how I teach it. And that's how we live our lives. But I just want to flip it for just a second. In Jewish mysticism and in Sufism and Islamic, different kinds of mysticism in Islam and things like that, there is an idea, and it's not just in mysticism in Islam, there's an idea that God spoke. There's God's word. Even if you go to a synagogue and you see the way they bring out the Torah, the scrolls of the Torah, the way they handle it, and the kind of reverence they have for it, or the kind of reverence that Muslims have for the Quran, the word of God, and put it on the highest shelf of the house, kiss it, always wash a certain way before you handle it. Let's take everything else aside, everything else that we've set aside, all this rationality, all this stuff, put it aside for just a second. There's something very powerful to a human being. We talked about transformation. There's something very transformative for a human being when they believe that God actually spoke at some moment in time. And they could take that word, those words, and believe it to be some sort of communication, because then it speaks to them at all times. Mm-hmm. And so it's not just that word or that book seems alive. The whole world begins to seem alive with God's speech for these traditions. There's something very powerful about that. It's something that I'm interested in. Actually, I want to write my next book on this.
So good. And maybe our next podcast,
I'll be your guest.
I have to bring you two back because we have
me back. But Christy has to be here.
That's the philosophy.
I'm not doing it without Christy.
Because we have not even tapped into.
No. You just started to tap into it.
So we'll have to set this up again and soon.
Yes.
Okay. Continue this dialogue. And so I appreciate you both for being here today and being a part of this. This was fascinating in terms of just being able to have this conversation, which is why people should consider philosophy courses and philosophy majors. And the
interfaith dialogue certificate.
If you want to major in religion or philosophy or humanities, we're all in the same department.
Yes. So thank you both. I appreciate you being here today, and especially in light of it being World Religion Day. And so I'm going to end it with that. We have a podcast coming up next Wednesday with my mentor, Dr. Thomas Parham. And we're going to talk about MLK and things along those lines. So I'm excited about that. But I thank you all. You all have a great rest of the day. I thank the Foundation Office for being a part of our podcast and helping us to get off the ground and do the things that we do so that we can have these conversations, because I think it's important, not just for the three of us to have that conversation, but for others to think about what's been going on and have that conversation as well. And so thank you. And
thank you. It's a pleasure.
Thank you. It's a lot of fun.